And so I want to encourage you to be tuning in next week. But right now, let's go and watch the message from Pastor Simon. This is going to really bless you today.
It's my privilege to spend some time with you this morning, or later on in the day if you're watching this later, to talk about fathers and something to do with Father's Day. First of all, I'd like to say this. It's my privilege always to speak to anybody and to talk about this topic. It's such a wonderful topic. I feel utterly inadequate in one sense, and yet have had a lifetime of learning, both being fathered, being a father, and being a grandfather. I have 9 grandchildren, and that's such a privilege to watch them growing up. But you know, I would say that the 2 or 3 of the greatest things that I've ever had the privilege of doing in my life, number 1 would be meeting Jesus and the transforming effect of meeting Christ and learning about my Heavenly Father, which, by the way, is a learning journey. Secondly, getting married and having a family. I look back with tremendous fondness on those many years of being a dad. Now, naturally, I'm still a dad, but I think it's one of the greatest privileges I've ever had. People talk about the privilege of maybe being a CEO of a company, or maybe an entrepreneur, or maybe having a position of influence. And these things may well and truly be good within themselves. But to me, the privilege of being a dad really is right up there. And like most dads, I've succeeded and failed. Fortunately, I haven't tragically failed, but I'd love to say to you, did that well, got the certificate, progressed to the next level. I don't think you ever do. It's always a learning process. We take into our fathering the fathering we had. And my dad was a good man and lived his life as a good man, which can sound a bit dry and boring, but actually it was good. He was a good man. He was emotionally fairly distant. That was typically post-World War II male. But he did everything within his power to provide for and care for his family. And that was my dad's form of love. So in that regards, I've had a good underpinning. But I think in regards affection and focus, that's something that I've had to learn and have failed at times with. And I'm sure if you ask my children, they would tell you much the same. Please don't, though, because I don't want it to be confirmed. So, imperfect father, that's what you're looking at. That's what every one of us are, the imperfect fathers. You know, it's remarkable, and this is my second point, is that Jesus introduced the Father to his disciples in a way that was revolutionary. Now, the idea of God being a father is not unknown in the Old Testament. It was spoken of by various rabbis. It's certainly alluded to in the scriptures when he talks about caring for them as a father. So the concept of God being father is not foreign to the scriptures. It's there. But what Jesus did is that he made it real, tangible, upfront and personal. And I think, well, I wonder, how did Joseph react when Jesus was 12? And it says that his mother and father took him up to Jerusalem for the festival. And on the way home, because families they didn't really check whether he was with them because their families were kind of large communities. And they just assumed that Jesus would be somewhere. Clearly, by the age of 12, he'd been quite a remarkable child anyway, so I hardly think they were overly worried. But a few days' journey out, they realised he wasn't with them. And so they went back. And when they found him, they were, you know what it's like when you're a parent? Your child's missing, and then when you see them, rather than saying, oh, thank goodness I was worried about you, you blast them and say, where have you been? Which is more your reaction than their problem. But they got back to see him in Jerusalem and they said, why did you do this? And Jesus said these words. He said, I had to be about my Father's business. I was in my Father's house. Why would you think I would do something else? I wonder what Joseph thought. Wow, where does that leave me? There must have been something about Jesus and his relationship with God the Father that even at the age of 12 was remarkable And, well, it was to the Pharisees, wasn't it? Because they sat and listened to him as he questioned them, and they were stunned by the wisdom he had and by what he was asking them. And so he brought this sense of God as Father. And I think if there were words that described God as Father, they would be words like this: security, strength, and that old adage, the favourite at the moment, safety. If you want real safety, you don't need safe places, and you may need those. Or if you want real safety, God as your Father gives you a safety beyond comparison. But there we have Jesus calling God his Father. So he introduced to the disciples, and therefore to the church age, this sense of God as a Father, not God as a distant prophetic judge, or God as the great creator. The big theme that's wrapped up in the Old Testament about God would be things like, well, there's more to it than this, but the idea of God was known as the creator. You find all through the scriptures, constantly they refer, Psalms, Proverbs, the prophets, through the histories, the idea of God creator is constantly alluded to or spoken of very clearly, because God was the almighty creator of heaven and earth. But that does this thing called distance between humans. And to have a dad as a figurehead is never as good as having dad as a person. And what Jesus did is he brought that creator God into new focus for them as Father, someone to be trusted, someone to go to, someone that would bless and help and admonish and where necessary discipline, which is what a father should be able to do in a proper sense. So Jesus brings this very new aspect to us as God as Father, and that's part of the revelation of Christ in the New Testament. And then my third point, which will be the longer point, is I want to look with you at a remarkable father in the scriptures. And you know who it is already, don't you? Because there's only one or two that you'd think of, and that's right. It's the father of the two lost sons. You say, what? There was one? No, actually two lost sons. Because there was an unrighteous son who was clearly lost, and was a righteous son that was not so clearly, but still lost. And I want to read from the scriptures and let their wisdom and sense and revelation come to you as we read. And I'm going to make comments as we go so that we look at something about what a father is like. This is Luke chapter 15 and verse 11. Excuse me, a little bit of vodka always goes down well. Oh, that's disappointing, it's water. And he said, verse 11 of Luke 15, and he said, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. Which is another way of saying, I'd rather you were dead than alive. So surely he didn't think that. Well, to ask for the inheritance, which he would have got at the father's death, to ask for it now is kind of saying, I'd be happy that you were dead to get the inheritance. So the father, rather than waiting to die, gave him the inheritance, which would have been actually quite an unusual move. Especially knowing the son, he must have thought, what is this going to lead to? But you know, there's something in a father that's wise to hold his counsel. You can't save your children from their actions. You can't stop them doing what they want to do when they're of age. Now, you may be able to restrain them when they're 3. Good luck to you. Or maybe even 12 or 13. You can probably physically stop them from doing something, or that their circumstance doesn't allow them to go to a certain place and do that, whatever. But once they're of age, and this young man sounds like he was old enough to ask for the inheritance, so we must assume at least late teens, maybe early 20s, maybe even 30. Not quite sure. When it says younger, it was just that one of them was younger than the other, that was all. Doesn't mean he was young when he asked. Now, it's interesting. If you are able to let dads, you have to let your children go. I think from the age of about 12 years old, the art of parenting is the slow letting go of the child. It's a disaster if you hold power over your child until their late teens. They'll either be so compliant they will not know how to fend for themselves away from your presence, which is a disaster for their future, or they'll be so pent up that they'll just go absolutely crazy. And neither of those are good options. So you've got to start letting them go, be responsible for more decisions. And eventually when they leave home, it's a natural process. A great sorrow to you. I hated seeing my children leave home, but I knew it was wonderful for them. They needed their own life. They don't need their dad looking down across their shoulder every 5 minutes to figure out whether they're doing right or wrong. And when they get even older, your job as a dad is to completely let them go, to make their own choices, be responsible for their own actions. And my counsel to most dads is only give advice when it's asked for. Otherwise, it's not going to be appreciated. There may be an occasion where advice may help them from making a bad decision. But if that's your constant communication with your child, that is not a good father. You have not let them go. The prodigal left his father's presence. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, which would be the money, and he took a journey into a far country. And there he went as far away from dad as he could go. He squandered his property in reckless living. It's all a very nice way, sanitized way of saying it, isn't it? And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, wouldn't you know it? That's not in the scriptures. And he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out into his fields to feed pigs. That's not going to go down well in a Jewish story, is it? That's like, how low can you go? Well, he had gone as low as you can get. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, Dads, sometimes your child has to go the full journey to come to themselves, to return. Let them go the journey. In most cases, I know there are exceptions to this rule, but largely the rule exists for good reason. How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, he said, but I perish here with hunger. I will rise and go to my father. Isn't that wonderful? He knew who he could go back to. A good dad, you can always go back to a good dad. A bad dad, you don't go back to. And that's like having hope cut from your future. And he was a good dad. I will rise and I'll say to him, Father. I love the first word he thought. He rehearsed this. Father. He wanted to acknowledge his dad. He said, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So he rehearsed what he's about to say to his dad. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. This is an interesting picture. We don't know how many years the son had been away. Maybe only 2 or 3 years. Maybe longer, maybe less. But I doubt the dad was at the end of the drive every day, if they had a drive to be at the end of. I doubt he was out there looking every day. But then, maybe he was. Maybe every day he stood and gazed down that long, dusty road in Palestine and looked out and wondered, could it be today? There's a puff of dust in the far distance. I wonder if that's my son. And then he says it's just one of those little whirly devils that throws sand back up into the air. And then another day, and it's a caravan of traders who pass by the father's property. I wonder. It's worth wondering. And then it said that he felt compassion, not anger. Look, if your child's done wrong, Dad, and you feel riled about it, angry about it, probably not your best day to react like that. He showed compassion. And he ran and embraced him and kissed him. Isn't that wonderful? the dad picked up his robe and took off down that long, dusty drive, if there was a long, dusty drive, and there he saw his son coming. And the son, I wonder if the son, like earlier in the scriptures, where Jacob and Esau, when Jacob saw Esau coming to him, he was terrified that his brother was going to take his life. I wonder if he thought, Dad's furious. He's furious. He's got his men with him. The dust was swirling up from Dad. Perhaps it's hiding his hired servants, and they've come out and they're going to reject me and say, don't you ever come back here again. Don't you ever darken my doorstep with your reckless life and living and your loss of your inheritance. You little snot, never come back here. Maybe the son thought that. But then when he ran and he fell on his neck and he embraced him and he kissed him on the cheeks. I'm assuming that. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And you know what's amazing? He didn't finish the rest of his speech. He didn't have time. The father cut him short. The father was too excited. The father said to his servants, so the servants must have been with him. Which adds to the plausibility of the picture of the son wondering if he was about to lose his life at the hand of an angry father. And he said this, the father said, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. That's unexpected. And put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. He was in poor shape, wasn't he? Hardly any clothing, no shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Isn't that wonderful? There's this picture of a father who let the son go, who let his child go, and let them face the consequences of their own decisions, which a good parent must do. But when the child, having realised the mistakes they'd made, come back to the only place they knew, which was home, the father was open-hearted, welcomed him back, and they had a festival. It's important to say this. It wasn't a reward for his behaviour. It was a celebration that someone lost had been found. And then there's the other son. And the other son was the oldest son. And you know, when over the years as I've read this story, I've always been ticked off at the younger son. And I've always felt sorry for the oldest son, because the oldest son didn't live riotously. He lived faithfully to his father, but he was just as lost. And even he didn't understand his father properly. The oldest son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of his servants and said, what are these things? And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because you received him back safe and sound. Isn't that wonderful? But no, he was angry and refused to go in. Second time the father has to go out and meet his son. Went out to see the lost son, he now goes out to see the second lost son. And he came out and entreated him. Whereas with the other son, he just had to embrace him. This one, he had to entreat. He had to try to win back out of his angry state and calm him down so he could see clearly and not with his deep, deep sense of bitterness and anger at what had happened. And his father came out and said to him, look, these many years, he said to his father, look, these many years I've served you, and I've never disobeyed your command. You never gave me a young goat, let alone the fatted calf. That's what he's saying, that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. Isn't that so much the religious mind, the righteous person? Everything's theirs, but they just don't see it because their life's lived by strictures and structures and what you do and what you don't do and how you please and you don't please. It's the religious mind. And he'd been a good son. Literally, he had been a good son. He'd caused his father no grief, but he was causing his father grief this day because he was stopping his father celebrate the finding of a genuinely lost son. And then he said it was fitting to celebrate and be glad. It's not a reward, son. I'm not rewarding him for his bad behavior. For this, your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. What a dad. Want that kind of dad? Be that kind of dad. Because you may not have had that kind of dad. That parable beautifully expresses that long-suffering, waiting for a person to come to their senses, love of a father. And I think good dads will do that. They give room to their children, as I've already said. They give this breathing space to their child. And you know, if you lock your kid up too much, the only way out is by rebellion, or they will come out with a repressed personality, which may be worse, because what might come out long term may be better, may be worse than short-term rebellion. So be like that father. If your child's had a tough day, and I've got friends whose children have lived very riotously away from Christ, and you know, to their honour, they have maintained a careful, gracious heart under all the pressure, and you have to do that. You've got to maintain that. And here's this father who's like God the Father. And I'm not sure what situation you find yourself in today, but you may be listening to this and go, you know what? Well, I'm a long way down that dusty road from my father. And people often say this, I'm going to make my life better so that God will accept me back. Wrong choice. You'll never make your life better. Come back to a gracious Father. Come back to a receiving Heavenly Father who, just like with that son, with his prodigal, he welcomed him home. He kissed him. He melted the son's fears. He melted the sorrows of his own heart with his love. And I imagine him sitting on a grand chair looking at his son and all the people dancing and celebrating and laughing and eating and drinking. And I imagine the father saying, I'm so glad I was a dad. Didn't like all the bits and pieces, but how wonderful to see this restoration. Be that kind of dad. Be gracious. Be kind. But, sorry, back to my point. If you have been a long way from your father, make a decision today. If I go back, and I can tell you this, your Heavenly Father will receive you back into His arms. He will embrace and kiss you in His Son Jesus, in a way that will melt your fears and melt your anxieties and melt away the bad mistakes you've made and give you a chance inside God's community of God's church to rebuild your life. Run back to your father, get with his family, and see what God can do with you. Fathers, have a wonderful day. We honor you for being a dad. Not the easiest job in the world.